In the previous two lectures, we learned how to use the deck constructor to instantiate a deck object, to create a new deck object, and we also learned how to access a deck property to get information about the state of the deck object. In this lecture, we'll access some object behavior for the deck object. Again, we're starting with the code that we ended with last time. I'll add a comment here that says shuffle and print deck. And I'll add a blank line between this and our previous output so that we can separate all our different outputs. Now I'll tell the deck to shuffle itself. So here's the documentation for the shuffle method. First, we'll look at what data type the method returns. And we see inside this magenta circle, we see that this method returns void. In other words, it doesn't return anything. And that makes sense because, we're just shuffling a deck. We wouldn't expect the deck to give us anything back. It's just reordering the cards in the deck. The other thing we need to know before we can call this method is that there's nothing between these parentheses. And we'll get to the terminology for that for the next method. So for now, just like the deck constructor, this tells us that we don't have to provide any information when we call the shuffle method. As we did when we had print up here, I start with the name of the variable that holds a deck object, and then I'll tell it to shuffle itself. And I'm calling a method, not accessing a property, so I need parentheses. And I know from the documentation that I don't provide any information here between these parentheses, so I don't. And now I'll print the deck. When I run the code, I can see that the deck is not empty. And now I can see that the cards are in a random order. They're not just going up all the clubs and then all the whatever came next and so on. I've shuffled the deck successfully. I'm going to get rid of shuffling and printing the deck just so that we can actually see what happens when we cut the deck. And I'll also make it print the deck back here so we can remind ourselves of the original order of the deck. So I'll say cut and print deck. I'll add a console write line. And here's the documentation for the cut method. The first thing we notice is that it also returns void, so it doesn't return anything. Again, that's as we'd expect when you cut a deck. You're just sort of splitting the deck somewhere in the deck and putting the top half underneath the bottom half, though it may not be half. And so you don't get anything back. You're just, again, reordering the cards in the deck. The thing that's new for this one is that we now have parameters. Well, we have one parameter. Specifically, we need to provide the location at which to cut the deck. And so this information about the parameter tells us that we need to provide an int. We don't care at all when we're calling the cut method that it happens to be called location inside the method, but we do care that we're supposed to provide an int. So we use that information, and now's a good time to talk about a little bit of terminology. When we're talking about information that gets passed into a method, from the method's perspective, those things are called parameters. That's what this word right here is, parameters. When we think of that information on the calling side, when we're calling the method, that information is called arguments. Now, lots of times, programmers will just say everything's a parameter and that's fine. You don't have to be a jerk. You can recognize what they're trying to say. But really, from the method's perspective, they're parameters. From the calling side, they're arguments. And now, I'll cut the deck, but remember, we need to provide a location here for where we want to cut the deck. And I'll say cut at 26, so we're cutting right in the middle of the deck. And then we'll print the deck again. So what will happen is, we'll create our deck object and print it in its original card order. and then we'll come down here and we'll cut the deck in the middle and we'll print it again. When I run the code, you can see we used to have clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades, and now we have hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds. So I successfully cut the deck right in the middle. And this is the first time that we've actually provided an argument to a method that we're calling on a deck object. We've already been providing an argument here to our console WriteLine method to tell it what to print out, but this is the first time we've added an argument for a deck method. The last method we want, and I'll comment this out also, is let's take and print the top card from the deck. So here's the documentation for the take top card method. Different from the other methods we've been talking about, this method actually returns something. This return type is not void. This actually returns a card object. And so that's important as we call the method. And we see that it has no parameters. We don't have to tell it which card to give it to us because we can't cheat. We can only take the top card. As we saw in the documentation, the take top card method in the deck class returns a card object to us. So first we'll do this the standard way, where we would actually save that return value in a variable. And I'm going to save it in a card object because that's the data type it returns. And I'll call this variable card, and I'll set it equal to deck.takeTopCard. And now I can actually print out information about the card. Let's actually see how this works if I just say, sure, print out the card, because it probably doesn't work the way you expect it to. Let's go ahead and run the code. I'll add a blank line here. And in a moment, I'll get rid of this printing out whether or not the deck is empty because that's a little confusing. But this is printing out the card using deckClass.card. What it's telling us is the data type of this variable. And the data type of this variable is card, but card is actually contained in this namespace for this example. So it's just giving us the full data type for the variable. And that's not really what we want. I said I'd comment this out because it's confusing me, if not you. And now we'll come down here and say, well, I don't really want to print out the data type of the card. What I'm really interested in is characteristics of the card, like its rank and suit. Well, it turns out that I happen to know, and you could learn by reading the documentation, that we actually have a rank property for the card class. And we have a suit property for the card class. So instead of printing out the data type of the card variable, we'll actually print out the rank and suit of the card object that the takeTopCard method returned. So the deck prints out from bottom to top. So the King of Spades was at the top of the deck after we created the deck object. And I took the top card and put it into my card variable. And then I accessed properties of the card variable to see that it was in fact the King of Spades. And this is the most common way to call a method that actually returns a value. We can, if we choose to do so, we can call a method that returns a value and not put the result anywhere. Think of it as taking the top card and then throwing it away. We don't have a reference to that card, so we can't print out its properties or anything. We've just taken it off the deck and gotten rid of it. And then I'm going to take the top card from the deck and print out its rank and suit. So you can see that I end up with the Queen of Spades saved in the card variable. So that first call to the takeTopCard method took the King of Spades off the deck and threw it away. And the second call to the takeTopCard method took the Queen of Spades off the top of the deck and put it in the card variable. so that when we printed out the rank and the suit of that card variable, we got the queen of spades. It is uncommon and often a mistake to do it this way for a method that returns a value, but there are some rare cases where you might want to do that. This is not how you want to do it, as you'll do exercises and programming assignments in this course, but I wanted to show it to you both because it's possible and because it can be a common mistake if you aren't used to calling methods that actually return values. And now we've called all 4 methods that are exposed by the deck class. To recap, in this lecture we learned how to access the deck object behavior through methods, and we used the documentation to make sure that we were calling and using those methods correctly.